somebody telling me that, okay.
Is anyone talking?
No, not yet. I was
Oh,
just waiting
okay.
for people to get admitted in. Still says joining for several people, so I'll just give it another minute. Okay, welcome. Thank you all for joining us. My name is Angie Latour, and I am a grant manager here at OVW. I am joined today in presenting with attorney advisor Debbie Murphy and financial grants management analyst Heidi Hull, and we are supported by many of our colleagues here at OVW. So you can move to the next slide. Thank you. Today's presentation is focused on the match requirement for STOP funding. We've been working here at OVW on an updated match calculation worksheet that we hope will make things a little bit easier for you. We will go through that a little bit later today, as well as the match requirements generally, and take the opportunity to talk a little bit about extensions and closeouts. The new match worksheet will be distributed after today's webinar, and you should use the new form immediately. We will return any old match calculation worksheets we receive after tomorrow, May 21st, 2026. We do have a very full agenda and know that you are all very busy and appreciate you joining us today. We will plan to take some questions at the end of the presentation as time permits. And my colleagues here will monitor the chat. However, as always, please reach out to your grant manager with any questions. And also just a quick plug, hopefully you all received Amy Loader's email yesterday that was sent out regarding a new quarterly connection meetings that we will be hosting. Your grant manager will be sending out specific email invite instructions on that. The first meetings will be held the week of July 20th. And this also is a great opportunity to connect and ask any questions you have about, today's presentation, or really any questions you have about managing your STOP funds in general. All right, so let's get started. I'm going to turn the presentation over to Debbie Murphy, who will discuss the match requirement.
Yes, hello, my name's Debbie, and I'm one of the lawyers here at OVW. And for these purposes, I kind of feel like I am a very shabby replacement for Marnie Shields. I'm sure if she were here, I'll try to channel her. If she were here, I know she'd know all the intricacies of match. But we're going to walk through kind of the purpose, what match is, the various ways that you can meet it. We'll have some examples. And I also want to point out that there are several things available on OVW's website about match. There is a document specifically about match when you go to the resources about the STOP program. There's also a specific document there about match waiver. There are also several questions about match in the STOP FAQs. And we are always happy to answer questions that aren't addressed on one of our other documents. So just real quickly, like, people do sometimes wonder if it's a federal grant and you're giving this funding to a state, why make the state or subrecipients sort of pitch in? And I think the general answer is to just expand the resources that are available for any project that is, meeting the needs of survivors and addressing the 4 VAWA crimes. It's also intended, I think, to foster a dedication and kind of, have some skin in the game, I guess, for state, local, and community partners to the STOP program. So I'm going to just kind of read for you the 2 places in the VAWA statute that reference match. The first, this is in the VAWA statute, and it just says that the federal share of a grant may not exceed 75% of the total cost of the project described in the application. And then there's an exception to costs of the project for victim services or tribes. And then there's an exemption, it references an exemption that is in another part of the statute. I do want to say, this may be on an upcoming slide, but this actually only applies to states. Territories are exempted. So I guess if there are any territories on the call today, you can, either relax or go do something else. And then the exemption or the exception that was referenced, the exception that was referenced goes back to another part of VAWA that has grant conditions that are generally applicable to all VAWA programs. And it says that no matching funds shall be required for any grant or subgrant made under VAWA for any tribe, territory, or victim service provider. And then the second part has to do with how one might, or a state might, request a waiver, which we're going to talk about in a minute. It just basically says that there are these procedures for petitioning for a waiver. Okay, so a few general things just to kind of underscore. This does not apply, like I said, to funds awarded to victim service providers and tribes. So when an SAA or when a state is calculating the 25% that's matched, or the 75% that forms kind of the basis of match, you kind of slice right off the top any money that is going to a victim service provider or a tribe. Now, there are sometimes victim service providers who are receiving an award in an allocation that is not a victim service provider allocation. So a victim service provider could receive a subaward that is actually under the law enforcement allocation because they're going to be providing training to law enforcement. When it comes to calculating the state's obligation to match, the state is still obligated to match those funds in the law enforcement allocation, even if a victim service provider is one of the subrecipients. However, and we'll get to kind of passing on match a little bit to subrecipients, a state can never pass along a match requirement to a victim service provider. So if the state gives an award to a victim service provider in the victim services allocation, neither the victim service provider nor the state is on the hook for any match for that money. However, if the state subawards money to a victim service provider in the law enforcement allocation, then the victim service provider is still not on the hook for any match. They never are. But the state would still have to, find a match for those funds in the law enforcement allocation. This does apply also to any amounts that are used for admin costs. The match can be cash and in kind, and I think we'll talk quite a bit about in kind and what can qualify as an in kind match. The other thing is that the match does not need to follow the allocation formula. So, for example, if a state is passing on some of the match to subrecipients, and you're obviously awarding 75% of the funds to law enforcement, that's an allocation requirement. It doesn't mean that you're limited to getting your match from only law enforcement sources. So your law enforcement and courts subrecipients, for example, could come up with 100% of the match. But again, you're never, ever able to pass that along to service providers. So sources of match, obviously the state, your office, it can be a source of match, and we'll talk about some of the ways that can be the case. Private sources could be a source of match. For example, there may be some sort of contribution from a United Way that donates office space to a project that might be a source of match. And then this third category is a possible source of match are, as we've been talking about, subrecipients. So even though the requirement to come up with match and to meet this, to come up with 25% essentially of the project funds is the responsibility of the state can require some or all recipients to meet match. Like I said, except victim service providers and tribes. They can never be required to contribute to match. However, they might voluntarily contribute to match. And I think, the difference between a requirement and something being volunteer is, pretty important. It needs to, there needs to be no implication that a victim service provider would be more likely to receive a grant if they contribute match. There can't be any kind of stick over it, over them to contribute to match, but they could voluntarily. We do encourage states to take into account the ability of subgrantees to match the federal funds in deciding whether or how much of the required match to pass on to subgrantees. So your state better than anyone else. The areas that match is coming from. Your law enforcement communities and your victim service providers and your courts and so forth, prosecutions. So apply your own knowledge in sort of making an assessment of how much of match is going to be passed on. Let me see if there's any. Okay. So those are the sources, but what actually, where can match come from? Obviously, it can come from, money that an entity, either a subrecipient or a state, is putting into the project. However, I think that I think one of the areas that is the most difficult, or I guess maybe it requires the most kind of creative thinking, is looking for areas of in-kind match. So there are ways that the state or subrecipients can contribute to a project through things other than money. And I think that's, in fact, incredibly common. So a couple of examples would be expendable equipment or office supplies. The state or a subrecipient is contributing to the project equipment, a copy machine or something else that's benefiting the project, office supplies, so long as those are things that are not paid for with other federal funds. That can be a source of match. Workshops or education or training materials. So I think many entities can possibly be getting some sort of training that's provided free to the trainees. In that case, the fair market value for comparable training and for those materials, the amount of that fair market value can be counted toward the match. Workspace. If there is workspace that is donated to a subrecipient, for example, then the fair market value of that space, sort of comparable space on the rental market, the amount of that can also be counted toward the match. Value of time donated by professionals. So this is going to be, kind of an example where you might have a subrecipient in particular might have accounting services donated, graphic design services donated, some other sort of, some other kind of professional services that are necessary for the project. And if that is donated, then you can count the value of that consistent with whatever rate would be paid for similar work, which would include fringe benefits and anything else that would be paid. Volunteer services, the same kind of idea applies, but if a subrecipient uses volunteers to staff a project, then the value of the time of those volunteers can be counted for match. And generally speaking, the valuation method should match, how the recipient would value those same skills and expertise for their own employees. So very, very important. All match contributions have to be documented very carefully, and this includes the basis for determining the value of any personal services, materials, equipment, space. So if you're counting, the volunteer time of, folks working in a funded DV program, for example, that needs to be documented how many hours, what the hourly rate is that you would value that particular person's skills. And so, it just needs to be very clear how you have calculated that contribution. Okay, so I'm going to walk through a couple of examples. And this is just a limited amount. The other thing I wanted to say is, in addition to the materials on the website and the statutory provisions, there are also regulations about the match requirement. I think the regs probably, everything that's in them is probably reproduced in one of those documents on OVW's website. But if you want to go look at them, they're at 28 CFR 90.18. So again, those are the match regs in case anybody wants to really do some, late night reading on that. So a few examples. Let's say that the state is providing office space for a project. The cost of utilities, insurance, security, anything that, relates to that office space can be counted toward the match, so long as it's not being paid for with federal funds. If the office space is donated by an outside source, then the rental value of space on the open market, like what would comparable rental space be, can be counted toward the match. Salaries of state employees that are working on the grant-related purposes, so long as those salaries aren't paid for with grant funds. So your salary, for example, if your salary is not paid for by the STOP program, then whatever portion of your salary or of your time that you spend working on grant-related purposes can be counted as an in-kind contribution that goes toward the match. And again, that would include, the portion of fringe benefits, all of that sort of thing. Your implementation plan, whatever goes into developing the implementation plan, the planning committee members, if they are not already compensated, you could count their time as whatever the value of their time is spent on activities that go into developing the implementation plan. You can count that toward the match. You can also count any other costs that go into developing the implementation plan, again, assuming they're not already paid for out of the grant. So that might be costs of transportation to your planning committee members, prep time, any volunteers involved in the project. So With regard to subrecipients, salaries of any employees on the subgrant that are working on grant-related purposes but are not paid for with grant funds. So if you're giving a subgrant to an organization or a law enforcement agency or whatever for a particular project, and they have a detective or officers or admin people who are using their time to work on grant-related purposes, they can, so long as it's properly documented, you can count the value of those particular positions, including their salary, benefits, that kind of thing, proportional to how much time they're working on it. So this might be, various people working at a shelter, a prosecutor working in a sexual assault unit that is getting a subgrant, any other, employee or volunteer. Reasonable value of any donated tangible goods. So, for example, victim service providers especially will oftentimes get a lot of donations, clothing that's donated that might be for use for victims. The value of that clothing can be counted as an in-kind an in-kind contribution that would go toward match. The value of any other donations that come from companies, food, toiletries, all the things that sometimes companies and other institutions donate to entities for the benefit of victims. The value of any donated furniture, computers, supplies, all of that kind of stuff can be counted toward the in-kind. Can be counted as an in-kind contribution to the match portion. So I know there are going to be some additional information provided about match waiver, but a state can request a full or partial match waiver or waiver to the match requirement. And the basic standard is of whether or not this is granted has to do with whether or not the state has adequately demonstrated a financial hardship. And so what I have listed here are the things that a state would need to document in requesting a match waiver. And if I'm not mistaken, it's there's still an email. I'll let others talk about that. It's just a letter to the director of OVW documenting your need, your financial need and your request. And I believe that the process is still to send it to an email box specifically devoted to this purpose. The things to document are the sources of non-federal funds available for match. What are all of the sources you have out there that you could tap into? The amounts that are available. All to document very carefully the effort you made to obtain match. So, it's one thing to say there's a lot of money out there that's available for match and we didn't have time to ask about it, or we didn't have time to kind of figure this out, but you need to document that you made efforts and what those efforts were. Generally speaking, I think when waivers are granted, they're generally partial waivers of match. And so what needs to also be documented in the match waiver request is the specific dollar amount or percentage of the waiver that is being requested. You also should document the cause and extent of any constraints. So, what were some of the problems that may have happened this year? Were there changed circumstances that made it very difficult for you to, come up with the full match? Anything that sort of explains your particular situation. If possible, if it's available or applicable, specific evidence of economic distress. For example, if a state has experienced, a natural disaster, and there's, some portion of the state that, all of the kind of subrecipients in that area are really strapped for sort of unforeseeable extenuating circumstances, anything related to specific economic distress. And then You could also attach any letters from particular allocations attesting to hardship. For example, if for whatever reason there is some hardship that would be facing, law enforcement subrecipients that would make it very difficult, in a particular year for them to contribute match, any letters attesting to that. It is that a match waiver request is just for one one grant award. So if you receive a match waiver, it's not in perpetuity. It's not like, oh, the state of Montana has gotten this match waiver, and so in perpetuity we're going to view them, through this hardship lens, and they're going to have a new standard applied to them. So it's very specific to the particular grant. I am going to pass it on, I believe, to Heidi, who's going to talk a little bit more about match waiver requests and then, project period extensions and things like that. And I will continue to advance the slides.
Sorry for interrupting you. Thank you, Debbie. I'm actually going to talk about this, the next two slides.
Okay, sorry.
Yeah, no worries. Again, thank you. If you do decide to petition OVW for a match waiver, full or partial, you'll need to send that official letter to the email that's listed on this slide here. And again, as Debbie mentioned, the letter should really adequately demonstrate all of those financial needs and significant documentation. I put on this slide sort of the layers of review so that you can see that it really is a multi-layered review process and approval that's shown here that it'll go through. It can be very lengthy, and historically waivers have been granted for extraordinary circumstances such as the pandemic, or as Debbie mentioned, natural disasters. So we really wanted you just to see, the process it takes to review waivers and, what's all needed when if you do decide to petition OVW for a waiver. And you can advance that next slide, Debbie. Thank you. So as I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, we also wanted to take the opportunity to briefly highlight a few reminders about project period extensions and closeouts before we really get to that main event that Heidi will show in a couple of slides here. We do understand that, of course, there will be times that you will need a project period extension. And for many STOP awards, their June 30th might be the next time where the project period end date is coming up here. So this is just a reminder to please talk to your grant manager and submit those project period extensions as soon as you know you need one. A couple other things, sub awards cannot extend past the OVW project period. So if your state awarding cycle means that subrecipient grant periods are longer than that federal award, you'll need to request that extension right away. Because OVW awards cannot be, you'll need to request that right away. And then OVW STOP awards cannot be open longer than 5 years, a total of 5 years. But for extreme circumstances, we cannot approve extensions once the OVW project period has ended. So it's very important that you get them in before time. Your federal award cannot close, however, if there are open sub awards. I'm highlighting these points because these are all potential audit findings. And we have tried to simplify things for you in the formula unit. We have sample instructions and a sample letter you can use to fill in the information and get that submitted. I understand that sometimes it can be a little bit complicated, so we are working on a streamlined version of this letter for you all too. Next slide, please. So as you are working on that request, please consider the following. How much funds remain in your award? What is your agency's sub-award process? And the amount of time sub-recipients will need to implement the project and expend the funds. We at OVW suggest you give yourself a buffer between when that sub-award end date happens and the federal award end date happens. We generally recommend about 90 days after your sub-recipient end date to give you appropriate time to do that reconciliation. Next slide. So a couple of closeout reminders as we're talking about match. And before I turn it over to Heidi, please remember that you have 120 days after the OVW project period ends to complete your closeout package. And this includes making sure all award conditions are completed and you submit your closeout report during this time frame. And please ensure when you submit your performance report that it was submitted on time. And as a quick note, when you do submit your performance report, please submit it as final and not regular. Doing so, I know it seems odd and there's a pop-up that can be intimidating that happens once you hit final report, but there really is just the one report for stop awards. So please remember to submit it as final. Submitting it as regular will delay the closeout process on the back end because we'll have to reopen it. Okay, and I thank you for your time, and I will turn this over to Heidi to discuss the remaining items on this slide and then get to the actual updated match worksheet. Heidi.
Thanks, Angie. So for purposes of this training, I'll only cover what we review to close out a stop formula award, because there are additional checks that we complete for non-formula awards that don't apply here. So when a closeout reaches the first financial review level, my colleague D or I, mostly D, will quickly check to make sure that the administrative requirements have all been met. And then we focus our review on the financial aspects of the grant closeout. Our review includes taking a look at the final federal financial report, the FFR, and comparing the amounts reported to the amounts reported on the stop match calculation worksheet. There are 3 different amounts on the final FFR that should be the same as amounts that are reported on the worksheet, which I'm going to go over in just a moment. Once we've confirmed the amounts on the final FFR and the stop match calculation worksheet agree, then we'll review the final financial reconciliation to determine if a final payment is owed to you or if excess drawdowns may need to be returned to OVW. In either case, we'll contact the financial manager and the grant award administrator assigned to the award in Just Grants, and then we'll also copy your OVW grant manager on that correspondence. If funds need to be returned to OVW, we'll let you know the amount that has to be returned and how you'll go about returning those funds. If it appears that a final payment is owed to your state, then we'll ask you to confirm the amount that we believe is owed to you and to make sure that that agrees with your financial records. Once the final payment amount has been confirmed, we'll release the funds for drawdown in ASAP, and then we'll let you know that they're available. When the financial reconciliation is complete, which means that the total cumulative expenditures that you've reported equals the net total payments that we've paid out on award, then we'll move the closeout forward to the final approval, which is the last step in closing out the award. And at that point, any remaining balance on the award is deobligated and no longer available. Go ahead and next slide, please. As you can see, the updated stop match calculation worksheet, which again we'll share after the training, is very similar to the previous version. The fields highlighted in yellow, again, are the ones that need to be filled out on the form. We've made a few revisions that we hope will assist you in completing the form correctly and facilitate processing closeouts in a timely manner. We've included a reference on the worksheet to the line on the FFR that should agree with those amounts. I'll quickly go through the form. Line 1 is award number, no change here. This was on the previous version of the form. We added line 2, which is the recipient name, so the name of your SAA as it is in Just Grants on the award. Line 3 is the state. This again was on the form before, and it's still a drop down that you'll select from. Line 4 is the total award amount. This is new to the form, but it should be, you know, an easy one to complete. It's on your Word document as well as on the FFR. Line 5 is the federal share of expenditures. Again, this was on the previous version of the form, but we've added a reference to be clear that this amount should be the same as that reported on line 10E of the final FFR. Line 6 is the total subaward amount spent by tribes and victim service providers for victim services. Again, this was on the previous form. Lines 7 and 8 were also on the prior version, and these have formulas built into the form. So these amounts will automatically be computed when you fill out the prior lines. Line 9 is where any approved match waiver would be entered if applicable. Line 10 is the required match amount, and this is computed on the form. And then we've added a reference to where this amount will be reported on the final FFR. Line 11 is the actual match amount that has been provided by the state for the award. And again, we've added a reference to where this amount should be reported on the final FFR. Once the financial information has been completed on the form, the individual, you know, filling out the form or who was authorized by your state will include their name, signature, and date the form prior to submitting it to OVW. And then this form should be uploaded in Just Grants with your closeout. Debbie, next slide, please. Here we're highlighting the 3 fields that I mentioned on the FFR where the amounts reported should be the same as amounts that are included on the stop match calculation worksheet. One of the resources that will be sent out after this training is the stop match calculation worksheet tips for accuracy, which includes a sample final FFR and stop match calculation worksheet for reference. The tip sheet shows amounts from a sample FFR that we made up and where those amounts match up on the worksheet. Next slide, please, Debbie. Debbie discussed match waivers during her part of the presentation. I'm going to quickly cover what we're looking for during the award closeout if OVW did approve a match waiver. If a full match waiver was approved by OVW for your stop award, and again, as Debbie said, there's going to be a waiver per award, then the stop match calculation worksheet is not required. For the final FFR, $0 should be reported on line 10I, which is the recipient share required. And then it's also helpful if on the final FFR in box 12 remarks, that you put in a note that says your request for a full match waiver was approved by OVW. Next slide. If OVW approved a partial match waiver for your stop award, then the match calculation worksheet is required and should be included with your closeout and Just Grants. And as I mentioned, the amount of the match that was waived should be reported on line 9 of that worksheet. Next slide. So occasionally a state is not able to meet the match requirement for the amount of the stop award that was expended. When this happens, the allowable federal share of expenditures will be kind of recomputed based on the amount of matching funds that the state was able to provide. And this is done by kind of working backwards through the match calculation worksheet, kind of from the bottom up. Will help you, figure that out depending on how much of the award has been drawn down. Once the federal share has been recomputed, funds may have to be returned to OVW. But if this happens, you should contact your OVW grant manager for assistance, and then they'll kind of bring us into, the attorneys and also the financial team to help recompute your federal award amount. Next slide. Here's some helpful, or what we view as helpful hints that we hope will reduce discrepancies and speed up the processing of stop closeouts. So as I mentioned, please make sure that those amounts reported on the final FFR and the worksheet agree. I know sometimes this can be challenging because we've noticed that often one person is completing the match calculation worksheet while another individual may be completing the final FFR and just grants. Hopefully this session will help clarify how these two forms work together. If you need to revise the final FFR to change one of the amounts that's included and corresponds to the match calculation worksheet, then just a reminder, don't forget that the worksheet will also need to be revised. And then please don't overwrite the data validation on the form. We see this a lot when forms are revised. You might go in and just try to override one of the numbers, but then when we go back and double check the computations on the form, we'll notice that the data validation was overwritten so that now the computations are incorrect and now there's another error that's going to need to be fixed. And then finally, just remember to sign and date the match worksheet before uploading it into Just Grants. And also just another reminder to please change the date when you make any revisions so that we can be sure we're reviewing the most up-to-date version. And then this is a list of the OVW, the resources that OVW will be sending out after the meeting. And next slide. We just want to thank you for attending this presentation. I think we're going to have about 15 minutes or so that we can answer questions. If you want to put questions in the chat, go ahead and do so. I think I've seen a few pop up during the meeting. And then if you do ask a question that we don't have time to respond to, go ahead and email your OVW grant manager after the meeting.
We do have a couple of questions that were entered in the chat. We go up. So, does the new form still have an automatic rounding?
No, we fixed that. So it does allow for decimal points. Yeah.
Thank you. The next question, can a state use its legislatively appropriated line items for domestic violence service, excuse me, and sexual assault services to meet the match requirement?
I think that's you, Debbie.
Can you read that again? Sorry, I was trying to read in the, can you read that again? I
Sure.
was trying to find them in the.
Can a state use its legislatively appropriated line items for domestic violence services and sexual assault services to meet the match requirement?
Yes, I think they can. They just can't use federal funds.
Okay, another question. If a victim service subgrantee includes a match in their stop award application, are we required to get it removed as they are not required to provide a match?
That's a question I might ask the unit how they want to, how they think that should be handled. It definitely should not play any consideration at all in whether or not the entity receives a grant. So it should not put, the thumb on the scale at all of that applicant being, considered more favorably for funding than any other potential applicant. I don't know if others have thoughts about whether or not they should have them resubmit an application, so long as they're just not considering it as a benefit or in any way, sort of giving that particular applicant an edge.
Yeah, and Debbie, this is Amy weighing in. I mean, our relationship is with you as the state administering agency. You are the ones that are receiving and reviewing applications. I think from our perspective, we would not weigh in on about whether or not you would have that requirement removed or ask them to resubmit something. I think what Debbie was saying is that really that should not be taken into consideration at all. when you are reviewing their applications. It should be based on the merit of the application itself, and then you would follow the processes that you have within your state or territory.
And I apologize, I skipped a question. If the space is donated by the county, such as a shelter, can that space be used as match?
And who is the subrecipient is the shelter? It's a victim service provider, subrecipient, I assume. I'm going to assume that's what the questioner means, although you can write a clarification. Yeah, if the subrecipient is a victim service provider and the victim service provider has had space donated to them, even if it's from a county, you can count that portion of the space that's supporting grant related projects as part of the match, so long as that money didn't come from that the money that they're donating for the space didn't come from the grant in some other capacity. Like, the county is also a subrecipient in the law enforcement allocation or something, and they're giving, part of their space to the victim service provider for the project.
I have a question. If you overmatch, is it best to report the overage amount or just report the required match amount?
Both of those amounts are going to be reported. They're just different lines. So the you'll have the what were the two amounts? So the recipient share required, so the match that you required, you're going to put is going to be on the match calculation worksheet, and that is also on the FFR. The actual amount that you did provide is going to be reported on line 11 on the match calculation worksheet. And then that is reported on recipient share of expenditures, line 10J on the FFR. So the actual amount is reported on both forms as well as the required amount, even if they're different.
I think those are the questions that are submitted, but just as a reminder, it was Amy placed this in the chat, that territories are not subject to the match requirement.
Thank you, Mo. Does anybody else have any other questions that they are hoping to be addressed now? All right, well, certainly this is not your last opportunity to ask some questions. I want to thank Debbie and Heidi for co-presenting with me today, and all of our colleagues here at OVW who participated. And again, please reach out to your grant manager for any questions that you have, and look out for those connection meetings coming in July. Thank you all for your time, and have a great day.
Right, I think we're done.